zoom back in and focus on the mental health crisis. And throughout the semester, I'll present lots of different ways of making sense of what's going on right now in Western, educated, industrial, rich, and developed countries, in particular, high socioeconomic strata of these countries, in particular, campus of elite universities. And today, I'm going to want to draw attention to some aspects of child rearing, in particular, some hypotheses about the culture of helicopter parenting. So I'll talk a little bit more about attachment theory, but this is one way to look at some possible usefulness of Homo Fragilis theory, which also claims, and I've mentioned this before, that in general, the lower the threat, the higher the anxiety. And I claim that this is a general rule about human perception that is deeply, deeply perverse. Because in a sense, when we're faced with a real threat, we have the ability to activate all kinds of amazing defense resources, including social, institutional, and cooperative resources. If we have time, I'm going to want to explore the provocative hypothesis that the response to the COVID-19 crisis in weird countries is perhaps the most awesome, in the sense of full of awe, formidable expression of Homo Fragilis nature ever implemented on such a large scale. So Homo Fragilis is, again, not a moral concern about the human species. It's an empirical observation about this extraordinary caregiving instinct that we have. And the fragility trade-off, the risk of over-signaling fragility, is just one micro aspect of this positive dimension, fundamental, in my view, dimension of the human experience. So we can't not be Homo Fragilis. We can't not care for one another. There probably are and have been and will be just amazing ways to organize each other, one another socially, to be the best care receivers and the caregivers. But it may be that under certain conditions where we're somehow not providing enough opportunities for young humans to develop their own resilience and to in turn graduate to a caregiving position, we might be trapped in a loop of learned helplessness that also leads to conflict. So briefly, and I'll return to that, I think one possible diagnostic formulation for impaired Homo Fragilis, meaning not having grown to one's full potential, is having people who, for complicated reasons, have very, very, very low distress tolerance, a very, very high ability to assign external blame for what goes on in their own lives, and who are, in many ways, who have not been given the tools to cope, and again, to assume enough of a caregiving position. So I'm going to be reviewing a few of the emerging beliefs and rituals and language of some aspect of millennial and Gen Z culture that I find very anthropologically interesting, under the auspice of Homo Fragilis theory. But I do want to frame what I'm going to say with a very interesting psychoanalytic observation, which is that a lot of the times, the kinds of claims about what is true in the world that eventually lead to pathological behavior in the sense of everyday impaired functioning happen to be true. Just like it's very common for people who are psychotic to have extraordinarily rational beliefs, to have a very, very, very well-constructed rational edifice to justify their fears, but sometimes their fears are actually founded. So Slavoj Žižek, who's a very interesting Marxist, Hegelian, Lacanian cultural theorist and psychoanalyst, likes to mention this thought experiment by Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, who asks us to imagine a jealous husband, a pathologically jealous husband, where it turns out who's completely obsessed with the idea that his wife is cheating on him. So he mobilizes just every ounce of energy in his waking life to trying to prove that his wife is cheating on him. And it so happens that his wife is actually cheating on him, but his jealousy is still pathological according to Lacan. So Lacan is also not concerned with, normative ideas about whether or not we ought to police each other's bodies and whether we ought to be polygamous or monogamous. He simply notes that even if the object of his anxiety happens to be true, he's mobilizing way too much energy in thinking about something. And in fact, he's mobilizing so much energy that he's not in any way able to do anything productive to resolve this problem, because he may, talk to his wife. He may realize that actually she's cheating on him because he's so anxious to begin with. Who knows? We could visit so many scenarios of what he could do to resolve this particular problem. So what's interesting, and I guess I mentioned this because soon I'm going to grossly simplify some of the narrative claims of some aspects of Gen Z culture. I'm going to mention some of the sacred cows of woke culture, things like, I don't know, indigenous social justice and racial justice and climate change and, and trans rights and all things that point to problems that are empirically true. So none of these things are made up. Yet one of the claims is going to be that some of the ways in which culturally we sometimes mobilize ourselves can lead to the type of functioning that is, not very optimal, and that may be pathological, again, in the pragmatic sense of just having impaired everyday functioning. So again, I have reason to believe that the vast majority of the claims, the empirical claims made by Greta Thunberg are correct. I'm not a climate scientist, but it seems to me as though she points out things that are actually correct. We'll return to that later. So this is just to front the conversation, because it's actually really difficult not to fall for cheap moralizing, and it's interesting how even the language used by most theorists who have attempted to write about this problem are very divisive, and not very many of the books that I'm going to discuss briefly have achieved a lot of sort of conflict resolution or unity. In fact, as an anthropologist, it is this conflict that interests me. So Hera Marano is basically like a tough old Jewish grandmother. She's a New Yorker. She was the editor-at-large of Psychology Today for years. And she claims that she saw it all coming. She's really hilarious. She was my editor at Psychology Today, so we've had a few really funny phone conversations. This is a book she wrote in 1996 when she was really worried about the accidentally damaging and fragilizing effects of anti-bullying programs in schools. So the 90s, most of you were too young in the 90s, but this was episode 1 of the culture wars, right? This is when the term political correctness entered the public imagination. This is when a lot of the claims that are now being revisited and expanded were already circulating in the cultural imagination and in cultural conversation. But it was also a period of, well, as a Gen Xer, I certainly have constructed this completely romantic, idealized version of the 90s where everybody was tough and free and whatever. I'm sure it's completely false. But it's also a time when increasingly policies about, for example, banning peanut allergens and nuts in schools and being increasingly, tough on verbal assault, and where the bar of what was considered harm was beginning to change. And whether or not we agree with the language used, or indeed the moral conclusions of someone like Hera Marano, she was describing sociologically some very interesting transformations that I think we're cashing in on big time now, but that we didn't really see coming. Interestingly, later it turns out that for those of you who are interested in school psychology and whether or not anti-bullying programs work. I think there's quite a few meta-analyses that argue that no, because criminalizing perpetrators tends not to work. So it's often very stigmatizing for people who most of the time are already socioeconomically and racially disadvantaged. So these are the kids who are likely to just act out a bit and to be sort of pathologized and criminalized. So often being the sort of like zero tolerance policies turned out not to work very well, because they tend to fragilize the victims and they tend to criminalize the alleged perpetrators. I mean, this just to make a long story short. But this is also one ingredient where it became institutionally advantageous and sort of officially politically advantageous to come forward as a victim. Because the idea of having victim points, which of course we know is an integral part of our culture now, has not always been around. This is Jean Twenge that I've mentioned many times already. Her previous book was on Generation Me. This one is not so bad, actually. She really has this rather monomaniacal, one might concede, idea that the internet ruined everything. And I've mentioned that I have to keep this monomaniacal idea in check in my own theorizing, because I have tended to at times be a little unnuanced probably in thinking that the internet is just the worst thing ever to happen to humanity. But she, in this book, based on qualitative interviews and also based on the social science survey, which is an interesting survey that's been given to Americans and young Americans for close to 20 years, that doesn't have a very high response rate. So there's another methodological potential flaw there. But this is when she finds that younger kids have less distress tolerance, more of an external locus of control, that they spend less time face-to-face, that they're having less sex, less relationships. But that on the plus side, they're much more environmentally conscious, socially conscious, they're much more progressive. So then, of course, you get the conservative pundits who have their own access to grind, who say, well, that's the causal link, being a progressive makes you mentally ill or something. So let's remember that causality is super, super complicated, and that correlation is not causation. We just know that. We don't know why and how, but we know that there have been these changes. But this book, very, very interesting. Jonathan Haidt is probably the most skilled at all of these pundits who have commented on fragility culture, most skilled at, say, not becoming Jordan Peterson, not becoming himself a polarizing symbol. And because he's done a lot of great empirical work on the emotional basis of reasoning. A lot of good stuff. We'll cover some of his work later, but he wrote a fantastic book called The Happiness Hypothesis about happiness and about, it sounds cheesy, but I like it, the importance of ancient wisdom. So there's a lot of Buddhist wisdom, and but this book talks about, the rise of sort of fragility culture on US campuses, and he claims to be commenting on this from clinical perspectives of impaired resilience and increased conflict. But the book is not as polarizing as its title might suggest. This is a comment, this is a sort of a play on words from a famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, by Alan Bloom, who is a classicist at Yale University, who also claimed that he saw it all coming. So Alan Bloom was commenting on the very, very early cultural wars at the end of the 1980s, when the idea of what counts as the canon of civilization, what books ought we to teach to our youth, what stories should we pass on? And this is when postmodernism was beginning to not quite take hold, not quite become dominant, but become very fashionable in universities. And Alan Bloom made this observation, which I believe holds true to this day, which is that increasingly North American students at elite universities were no longer interested in their own history and in their own culture. They tended to increasingly look at their own history under a negative light, but he claimed they were not particularly interested in other cultures either, except for a, in his view, rather hollow celebration of their victimhood of Western, oppression from Western culture. And so Alan Bloom, who for sure is a conservative, said, well, that's rather condescending and, depriving other cultures and civilizations of their own agency. And in fact, there's so many things about those civilizations that is so interesting. Not everything is about colonialism. That was his claim. But it was, of course, a rather bombastic claim, the closing of the American mind. And recall that this particular debate has existed in every generation that the human species has known because of this conservation-innovation trade-off, right? So the idea that everything is going to the dogs because the youth don't know their place anymore. Well, there are texts from ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient India and China. It's always been around. It's just that now perhaps the vectors of information diffusion have been democratized to such an extent that there's more voices. That I mentioned earlier, that the rise of victimhood culture, a comparative sociological account of different ways of assigning prestige and stigma in different societies. But the focus was, again, to pick up on Jean Twenge's investigation, why are people born after 1994 comparatively more at risk of suffering from mental illness? In other lectures, I don't have them, but they're in the syllabus. You've seen the Canadian Association of Mental Health stats from prior to the pandemic, something like, 1 in 4 Canadians, will develop a mental illness during their lifetime, and it's much more so for youth. I forget what it's like now, but the rates are just exploding. And we've already tried to make sense of that together in this class through different perspectives, one of which for sure being reduced stigma, one of which for sure being increased access to care. Yet other factors may be at play. I've already mentioned in this, I find very interesting, I want to keep ramming this point across, this idea of intergenerational radical alterity, where again, remember, alterity means otherness, and in anthropology and philosophy, it's a very interesting problem. The extent to which other minds are knowable, the extent to which other cultural reality are knowable. Can you ever understand someone from a different culture? And we tend to assume that cultures are these static, unchanging, essential wholes, when in fact they change, and on the longitudinal axis, they change very much. So it's just basically funny and really interesting that now there's this whole, okay boomer and kind of culture, but also, okay snowflake. But the claims are basically identical, where young people find the old intolerant, unempathetic, and abusive, and the old also find young people intolerant, unempathetic, and abusive. Yeah, sure. We could talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so to be clear, these are the main arguments that are circulated out there, and the ones that is, of course, very well known to millennials and Generation Z, which is that the economic opportunities that boomers had are no longer there. We've already talked about that. It's never quite clear. I think when you control for different, so it's often said, for example, that the cost of owning a home has significantly increased, compared to incomes. If you look at the average income and the average house price, say in '79 when I was born, or in the '60s, in a lot of places the ratio is still the same. There are many urban bubbles like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, San Francisco, New York, whatever, Southern Florida, that have completely exploded, but it's not the case everywhere. But again, it's been pointed out that economic opportunities have changed. I also like to point out that there are many more kinds of jobs that people can hope for and get in the leisure industry, in the tech sector. So the path of expectations and possibilities was much more restrained, I would say, in the past. So there's also that. And we've also talked about expectations being higher. So people want purpose and they want meaning, which humans have always wanted. But typically the external metrics that they look up to find a sense of purpose and meaning are increasingly distant, sometimes increasingly specific, sometimes increasingly vague. But there are many more demands on subjects right now in terms of being an amazing social person, an amazing sexual person, an amazing professional person. So that, in my view, accounts for much more than what is actually out there economically. Again, there are, look at Montreal right now during the pandemic, there are many crappy working class jobs out there that just nobody wants to fill. And fair enough, or people would rather be on curb. But I think in boomer times, expectations were very different. You know, you got married, had kids, you made it work. So the internet, I won't talk about very much today because I have several classes, several entire lectures on different mechanisms by which the internet does interesting things to our brains and our societies. So we talked a bit about less face-to-face interaction, which has a lot to do with the internet, but maybe it's the other way around. Who knows? Maybe we were already kind of social distancing, which is why we kind of as a society settled on some technologies that reinforce that. I have no idea. I don't claim to understand the causality, but today I want to talk more about child rearing practices and this permeation of safety culture into the realm of raising children, and how that plays out at the level of mental health culture as well. So mental health culture, recall here, is I'm using a medical anthropological lens to describe the idea of mental health as an idiom of distress, as a sort of a culture-bound syndrome, as a way that modern, contemporary Western subjects tend to make sense of their distress through the lens or the idea of mental health. So I'm actually, when I talk about that, I can even be agnostic about whether or not there is a real biological basis, being a cause or a correlation. I'm talking about a set of narratives, a set of beliefs. So I want to talk about helicopter parenting. Helicopter parenting under different names is mentioned in Hara Morano's book, in Jonathan Haidt's book, in Jean Twenge's book. There are to date few empirical studies of helicopter parenting because, as you can imagine, it's a multifactorial phenomenon, which in fact may only exist in the minds of conservative researchers. Who knows, right? But here's my own attempt at defining helicopter parenting as a disorganized style of caregiving that is at once too permissive, but also overprotective. So in describing helicopter parenting to you, I'll be teaching you a little bit of conversational hypnosis and a little bit of anthropological linguistics to talk about the effect that language, certain propositions, has in shaping our expectations and shaping our behavior. So I will attempt to explain and operationalize what I mean by disorganized. Suffice it to mention that I mean something along the lines of producing disorganized attachments, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the clusters A's, B's, and C. But remember that there are secure attachments. So this is your secure, high trust in self, high trust in other. You know you're going to be okay if your mom goes away, but you have no difficulty bonding with her when she comes back. You can be avoidant, high trust in self, low trust in other. So you're going to be kind of okay on your own, but you're not really going to trust that your mom is going to come back. So you're going to be a little avoidant and you're going to have difficulty trusting others. When you have disorganized attachments, that is the most debilitating kind: low trust in self, low trust in others. So you don't trust yourself in any situation, but you also don't trust others. This is what we wish the least for little humans. Ideally, we all want to be in the secure range. We'll get into attachment theory more when we talk about the clusters. Attachment theory is not a be-all, end-all. In fact, there are some good tests out there. One of them is a simple kind of 3-item, which situation describes you best? I have difficulty trusting people. I find that, no matter how much I try, people get close to me, that's anxious. But when you take more fine-grained tests, you might realize that sometimes you have a different attachment style for different kinds of people. You could be insecure with your dad, avoidant with your mom. You could be avoidant with your friends, insecure with your superiors, with your bosses at work. So it's multifaceted. It's not one construct. However, it is, at least in the current state of psychodynamic theory, very much like personality structure, it is posited to be one fundamental aspect of personality, your disposition towards yourself in the world, that is relatively stable and relatively unchanging. It does change. This is why we have psychodynamic therapy, for example. You could do that with the goal of, I want to change my attachment style. It's possible, but it's hard work. It's not easy. So the hypothesis here is that helicopter parenting, in its, of course, idealized / demonized, it's the same version, at best, meaning at worst, it will produce disorganized attachment style in children, thereby structuring a lot of social relations and the relationship of the child to the world in a very pathological way. So I'm interested in double binds. If you've taken classes with Professor Samuel Ekolu, you might have come across double binds. Gregory Bateson, the very, very interesting early anthropologist, in his book, The Ecology of Mind, had all kinds of cool hypotheses about double binds. Gregory Bateson's insights were later integrated after the first Macy conference of cybernetics into what became the Ericksonian school of hypnosis. The Ericksonian school of hypnosis, after the works of Milton Erickson, who was just an extraordinary therapist, then were integrated into a much more pseudoscientific, yet quite empirically robust enough school of para-academic psychology called neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. So this is what pickup artists are trained in, but not just pickup artists, people like Tony Robbins, who trained in Ericksonian hypnosis and NLP. So there's a lot of pseudoscience in that it's typically a para-academic, as in you train outside of universities. So there's like a school of NLP at a strip mall somewhere, and you go to like a Tony Robbins type seminar, but it does cash out somehow. So there's lots of tricks in NLP. Things like, for example, a yes set. Some of you might have heard of that. If you get someone to say yes 3 times, typically they'll say yes the 4th time. So you ask someone, do you mind if I ask you a question? Yes, first yes. Would you mind helping me with directions? Yes, second yes. And then, so is McGill University really that way? Yes. And then, do you mind helping me out with $10? Yeah, sure. It works. So this is just the way in which linguistic propositions tend to, it's difficult to operationalize well, what happens, because these are theoretical constructs, but tends to activate particular schemas, so particular disposition towards behaviors, particular habitual constraints, which in turn trigger different modes of actions. So the double bind presents a forced choice without presenting the forced context of the choice. It sounds complicated, but it's in fact very simple. This is when you ask a child, would you rather go to bed now or in 5 minutes? The forced choice is you are going to bed. The child, of course, always will say in 5 minutes. So this is a very, very good way to get someone to do something that you want them to do by giving them the illusion that they had a choice and that they had agency. Well, a lot of medical practitioners know how to use this judiciously when they say, for example, do you prefer a pill or an injection? And the patient will typically say the pill, but the forced choice is you will take the medication. Whereas if you ask the patient, what kind of medication would you take? Or do you want medication for this? They might say no. And this goes back to the insight that, we know now, because I mentioned it 17 times per class, which is that the more choice, the more anxiety. So what I call the double bind of control is a way to socialize children into having expectations about their own agency, where they have, in a sense, distorted expectations about having much more agency than actually have in some domains, but also having too little agency. So in simpler terms, you give people too much choice in some domains and not enough choice in others. And this, or so the hypothesis goes, is a rather perverse double bind, which eventually structures your personality and your sense of self-regulation, your sense of self-control, your ability to cope, your ability to be even well within yourself, your ability to tolerate distress, your ability to understand and deal with your own complicated emotional reactions in impaired sort of ways. So we have, of course, and there's been a very historically odd movement, certainly in weird cultures, of treating children like little adults. Now it's interesting because if you read, say, cultural historians on the invention of childhood, there's a French historian called Philippe Ariès who claims that there was no such thing as childhood until the early modern period. This is a very common claim of a particular school of French historians who like even Michel Foucault said there was no such thing as homosexuality until the early modern period. It's just as though everything was invented then. It's not quite that simple. However, it does seem to be the case that, say, in Thomistic Catholic theology, the age of reason was 7. This is when one became a legal person, a person responsible for her own actions. You look at engravings and paintings in the Middle Ages, we did not assign different modes of dress to children. They appeared to be little humans. And that, recall, had been one of my insights working with street children in Brazil. A lot of them seemed, much more mature developmentally than what I would have assumed a normal child should be. But yet, you look at the cross-cultural record, for example, the ethnographic record, there is an interesting style of dialect we call motherese. Some of you might have heard of that. Motherese is when you talk to children in a very special voice, like, hello, little cutie, would you like to go to bed now, or something like this. So there are cultures that use motherese. And interestingly, so motherese is a way to inflect your speech so as to mark a special kind of affect. And of course, the recipient of the speech understands that the special kind of affect comes with just this distinct loving care. It's for them. In a lot of cultures, this is rather gendered. It's often feminized. In a lot of cultures, women also speak to their dogs like this. They can speak to elders this way. I know that there has for sure in the West been a movement to say motherese is just condescending and, we ought to, treat children as rational beings, which they are in some sense and also are not. But our culture is fond of giving many choices to children, involving them in the conversation, like saying, I won't assign a gender to my child until they can consent, or I won't circumcise my boy until he can consent. I mean, that's fine. It's just, these are just changes in belief systems. But often we raise children with a set of open-ended propositions which shift the agency back at them, or at least the illusion of the agency back at them. So would you like to go to bed? What would you like to eat? Also, you can be whatever you want to be. I always like to say that my mentor, Professor Cécile Rousseau, a child psychiatrist, says, this is the worst thing you could ever tell a child. It says, if you I just want you to be you, I just want you to be happy. And she says, a child who does that will rebel because, children will rebel by, attempting suicide or becoming a drug addict. So she says, rather, you have to tell them, it's doctor, lawyer, engineer, or nothing. And then they'll rebel by becoming a poet or an anthropologist or a musician. Secretly, you'll be happy. But they shouldn't know about that until much later. So I know when my own youngest son wanted to go into acting, I was delighted in secret, but I said, absolutely no, never, it's medical school. Or yeah, what can I do to make you feel better? It's a very, very dangerous proposition, even though, of course, we don't want to not say that. Rather, it's because we do have a responsibility for teaching the child how to make sense of their own feelings and how to cope with them. Absolutely. So that's another like fragility trade-off, is that when we are still in the subordinate realm, and we're just competing for care. So the risk is that we're going to over-signal, our own fragility, as I mentioned. But when we become caregivers, the risk is always that we're going to become too permissive. Maybe some of you know this already from taking care of your nieces and nephews or friends or others. But it takes a lot of work to properly neglect a child, because your instinct is always to overprotect. It's very difficult not to. And as a society, we probably haven't been very good at not overprotecting, again, because we have this great instinct. So these are just the kinds of propositions, open-ended, anxiety-inducing propositions, where the child grows up forming the impression that they can choose, that they have this great array of choice and that they have this great freedom. There, of course, is the beginning of anxiety. Recall, we've talked about that, because when risk is sort of like, well, if mommy is asking me if I want to eat and what I want to eat, if I don't decide, am I going to eat? Like, is she even going to come back tomorrow? It can be quite debilitating to feel at a young age that unless you desire it, unless you're responsible for it, nothing happens. So this is why we know that these sort of, this permissive style of parenthood tends to typically yield at least insecure attachments, not yet disorganized. But the problem then lies in other information that the child, or at least let's just call it a behavioral system, and let's just call it a statistical inference system, a statistical model. The child's body and nervous system and brain is integrating a model of what it can expect from the world and how it needs to act in this world in order to have its needs met. There's all kinds of information that is disconfirming the illusion that the child is acting on everything, because the world is almost entirely prepared for the child, and this is also historically novel. So recall, it wasn't the case throughout history everywhere all the time that we assigned special dress for kids. So yeah, kids like to pretend play. This is how they develop their theory of mind and their imagination. Absolutely. And there's always sort of temporally, ritually specific ways of being a little person. But the accessorization of childhood, the corporatization of the accessorization of childhood has also radically, archaeologically transformed the environment in which we grow up. So there's really cool contemporary archaeological studies of everyday life headed by an anthropological linguist. Her name is Eleanor Ochs, O-C-H, wonderful person. She's also very, very interested in double binds and how the language we're exposed to structures our expectations about the world. So Ochs and others, they have sent modern day archaeologists to survey modern suburban homes. They found that there's a correlation between the amount of stickers and things on a fridge and the amount of clutter in a house and the amount of objects. They document just like abominable things. I forget if it's like 20,000 or whatever, but just the amount of junk, the amount of stuff that people put in their homes. Also very historically novel, strange things. So having like family portraits or having pictures of people who actually live in the house, but yet you have them on the wall. So that's also very strange, just historically. It's very, very novel. But a typical hallmark of a suburban household of people who still have children, because we've talked about antinatality, is that the house is entirely baby-proof, it's entirely child-proofed, it's entirely colonized with, plastic junk, or if you're like of the upper middle class New Yorker reading type, then they're like classy wooden toys, but it doesn't matter. Just the entire space is completely littered with things that signal danger for the child, but things that signal that the child occupies the space. The ritual usage of the space is also entirely, if not child-proof, child-centered, right? So people report a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear about having children nowadays. Certainly, it probably has never been so difficult, and not just because we lack the networks of social support. Most people don't have their grandparents and aunties living nearby. There's that, but there's also the fact that there's all these expectations of everything that you have to do, like capitulating on your social life, on your aesthetic life, on your, so people have the craziest rituals. I always like to mention friends of friends who were trying to plan a play date, something like 2 weeks in advance for like a 14-month-old or something. And they couldn't do it because they had to prepare the child for daylight saving. So this is something that we do in our cultures. So for sure that the child grows up expecting that the environment is always going to be radically modified, is going to be made safe, yet under the illusion that it is of their own doing. They want something, they get it. So yeah, this is why, and it doesn't have to be this way, of course, you know, a very quick peek at the ethnographic record or simply just traveling, spending time with different cultures, we'll find that having a child can be a significant source of joy. It's fun. It can also be sort of banal. It's like, yeah, it's fine. There's a kid, whatever. It doesn't have to be this enormous concept and ritual and set of accessories and set of restrictions, but this is what our culture is doing. So again, the message is everything adapt to the child's needs and desires, and the world is adapted to the child. Yeah, what else is there? There's just accommodations. So helicopter parenting, again, I think in the popular imagination, the metaphor comes from the idea of the child hovering over, the parent hovering, you know, with the helicopter over the child. It's sometimes called lawnmower parenting, which I like better as a metaphor because it's sort of like you're clearing the way for the child's path. It's, in a sense, I think the differential diagnosis between tiger parenting and helicopter parenting is difficult to make, but I would say both entail just an enormous amount of parental supervision, of parental, you know, handling of what goes on. But tiger parenting simply has, I would say, just higher expectations and actually gives the child more opportunities to practice self-regulation. For example, if you're helicopter parenting, but you have very demanding parents who insist that you be in piano and violin and dance and clarinet and like, you know, and cross country, etc., then you actually do develop a set of skills, and you eventually, for example, come to trust your own body. You come to, you know, trust that you can function well in some situations. So it's not entirely evident that over-involvement in and of itself is going to be damaging, although there is for sure evidence of resilience from the kinds of children who are, as contemporary clinical paradigms would have them, neglected in the sense that they've had to learn how to care for themselves and care for their siblings when they were younger. Not managing boredom is often mentioned as a mechanism, and that's something that's been studied, I think, quite well in psychological science, is that one of the risks of constantly supervising, you know, a child is just not giving them an opportunity to learn how to solve micro interoceptive problems. Again, sort of like there's weird feelings in my body. What am I going to do about it? Boredom is interesting because there are many languages where there's not really a word for boredom. I know in French from France, you know, I grew up in France, we don't really have a word because ennuyeux is too literary. So it's very rare that you'll have a 5-year-old child who say je m'ennuie. So you could say, oh, il n'y a rien à faire là, je m'ennuie. But I'm sure this is a completely idealized version of my childhood, but I don't recall, because we didn't have screens, and it was very common for tiger parents to forbid TVs. So we just learn to do other things. I wonder sometimes if there's an added linguistic encoding to those cultures, those like English, for example, that have a very strong kind of boredom. Did anybody grow up with a language that did not have a word for boredom? Not a clear correspondence with the Anglo-American I'm bored. Go on.
Could you say like c'est plat?
In Quebec, yes. In Quebec. In Quebec, yes. C'est plat. Yeah. But Quebec, that's another can of worms I'm not sure I want to open, but there are many Anglicisms in Quebec French. So you all grew up, what about Mandarin? There's a clear correspondence? Yeah. And do Mandarin speaking children complain to their parents that they are that word? Yeah. Interesting. Because often a lot of not very linguistically proficient young kids, like say, verbal 2.5-year-olds or 3-year-olds, they won't say I'm bored yet, but they might feel some kind of interoceptive uncertainty, and they might say I'm hungry, or I'm tired, or they don't really know. And then their parents, tell them, no, that's probably not what you're feeling. It could be something else. So it's very important. We need a lot of guidance in making sense of our own emotions, and we need to be scaffolded into the possibility to just kind of operate on our own. But outside of a good semantic framework, also, it's very difficult. Hence, the pain threshold that I already mentioned, right? Like cultures in which parents are overly attentive to the first sign of, a little bump or a little fall. The child sees my parent freaks out. I get kisses, so that's good. I guess if I scream, I'm going to get more kisses. But also, mommy freaks out, so probably I should freak out too. And then there's this interactional context in which we learn to respond to, signals inside our bodies and assign a valence and assign a predictive value to them. Yeah.
So when I was growing up, I'm bored. And my mom would say, intelligent people are never bored. Figure it out. And so I was like, count 100 or whatever until I got off of it. But is there a difference between like letting a kid like almost sulk in their boredom and like figure it out on their own versus being like, you're bored, you want to do A, B, or C? Like providing these options versus the child having to like figure it out from all the things that can do.
Yeah, it's probably always about balance. If you providing double binds is reassuring, but eventually you want to open up the binds so the child can learn how to make choices of their own. But I like what your mother used to tell you, because there you have the kind of the cultural encoding of expectations as well. You're like, so we are of the people of so and so. These are the heroes that we look up to. So in your culture, it was intelligent people, right? These are like the semi-mythical figures that you kind of want to live up to. So you're given a model, you get a narrative model to live up to. It's sort of like, yeah, you're feeling this discomfort, but a lot of really smart people feel that too. And this is precisely when they feel that, they figure out something really interesting to do. Come back in a few, 10 minutes and tell me what you figured out. So there you've given, a bit of a double bind. You've structured, you've soothed and structured the child. Because if you just say, yeah, particularly if it's just presented as a deontological truth, it's sort of like, well, no, just deal with it. You have to be bored. No, that's complicated. But the problem again here, and here, of course, remember, I'm painting an idealized / demonized picture of the kind of the worst case scenario, but that the child has enormously unrealistic expectations about the extent to which she can choose everything. Also, very, very sad array of expectations about how, unless she acts on the world, she's not going to be safe. The world is not going to be met. Yet, with all that, the child has been made functionally incapable of finding the solutions to resolve whatever uncertainty, whatever kind of problem, because there is always a parental intervention. So there again, you have the anti-bullying program. It's great. I'm not saying we shouldn't have pedagogical ways to deal with conflict, but often it's sort of like, well, you don't have to deal with it. Some subliminal parental figure, so the principal or the teacher or the resource worker will come and will solve the problem for you. So there's another way in which having an external solution right away deprives you of agency and deprives you of the ability to learn those skills on your own. It's really, really hard to do, but schools have increasingly implemented a lower and lower and lower tolerance for discomfort of any kind, for uncertainty, meaning something that does not fit within the very rigid behavioral program. And then there's a kind of an external solution. And then there are very simple, mythical, heroic roles that are, so you're the bully, you're the victim.
Hi, sorry, I'm on Zoom, but I have a question.
Please, I'm so glad there's a Zoom question. Thank you.
Well, I guess I have two questions. What precipitated this sort of cultural change so rapidly and so dramatically? And then also, what sort of are the effects on the parents? I mean, I know you briefly mentioned, you know, kind of this narrowing of their personal life, their sexual life, their intellectual life, but is there any more research into that?
It seems there's some evidence of parental burnout, and there has been increasingly what I'm almost tempted to call a psychopathologization of the perinatal experience, where, well, the medicalization of birth has something to do with it, not that, and I'm not, mind you, making an anti-medicalization of birth perspective, because we have, and this is the trend that I want to discuss here, we have eliminated most of the real threats. So we have, thankfully, at last, drastically reduced the incidence of death in childbirth and child mortality, but we have given way, we have opened up a buffer of new existential problems that we're trying to deal with by medicalizing them also. So I was going to say I don't actually recommend, okay, take a look at parent groups on Facebook. Very, very interesting. A lot of cultural fragility stuff. There's a lot of sort of panicking, but there are a lot of also just very sincere expressions of absolute exhaustion and desperation. And it's quite sad. But there's an enormous fragilization of our expectations around this. So I would say this is what happens to the parents. What precipitated this, we don't know. Many things at the level of observable environmental stressors. Part of it appears to have something to do with having eliminated a lot of the actual threats, and then availing of our overactive nervous system to sort of continue to assign threat values to things that don't actually pose much of a threat. The transformation of our social and democratic norms that have been very progressive for about 200 years and that are always trying to just find the next problem that we can fix. Consumerism probably has a lot. Yeah, the childhood industry is extraordinarily lucrative. So there's all kinds of feedback loops with that as well. It's for sure a multifactorial kind of picture. So this is why I want to return to poor Greta Thunberg. My heart absolutely goes out to her. I just want to historicize and anthropologize a moment where children feel personally responsible, not just for, picking their activities and, their bedtimes, but also for saving the planet. And one could say that as a matter of objective facts about anthropogenic environmental degradations, this generation will pay the price. I'm not convinced that it's everyone will pay the same price. It seems to me that those people in low and middle income countries who will pay a much higher price don't have the cultural possibilities of having those kinds of activist roles, you know, one might say, where comparatively, it is in those societies where the threat is the lowest that the child anxiety is the highest. So you may all know that eco-anxiety is in the process of being in the DSM as a diagnostic formulation. Many, many children, this is a very, very common narrative content of children and adolescent anxiety who show up in PsychEmerge or in therapy and who cannot sleep at night because the planet is burning and be responsible. So this is a really big deal, and we can be agnostic about the extent to which there's an actual threat right now in their lives, but there is for sure a huge existential threat. So there's also all kinds of very, very well-meaning introduction of activist endeavors. And I was seeing just my 5-year-old nephew just came, like, had a huge, yeah, the planet is burning type drawing that he returned from school. So here I mentioned Greta Thunberg as well, as someone who experiences a lot of distress, but also as a symbol of a generation of children who, yeah, are structured to perceive their role in the world in very, very different ways. So these are some of the trends. I've mentioned them, so we know these, like crime rates have gone down, and there's this documented mechanism or phenomenon or trend where as crime goes down, fear goes up. So people are fencing themselves up, even though neighborhoods have become safer. That's true. That's true about car accidents as well. It's child kidnapping. As far as the popular imagination is concerned, the idea of like some random bad person in like a white van snatching your child, it's not going to happen. It's you're much more likely to be hit by lightning, and we know that whenever we get one of those Amber Alert messages, it's almost invariably a custody dispute. It's the mom or the dad who has not returned the kids on time. In Canada, at least, this is or child abduction. If it's not the mom or the dad, it's the uncle or it's the grandma, or sometimes, rarely, very sad. Yeah, I mean, drowning is a problem. Like kids drown in swimming pools. Like you have to be very careful if you have children in a swimming pool. And the earlier you teach them how to swim, the safer you are. So baby swimming classes all the way. Then problem solved. But people have been for sure fencing themselves up. I always struggle to make sense of this graph, not least because France is the only country that does not obey the trend, but of the amount of time spent with a child that mothers, I'm not sure if it's caregivers, gender neutral, or mothers, but here it says mothers. And people have been spending more and more time with their kids, which is odd because remember that what also happened since 1965 is women have been working a lot more. So it's a lot of double shifting. So we can, there are some, like say, like punk feminist perspective, like say Valerie Solanas, anarchist feminists who say, well, you know, freedom from work was pretty cool. Work sucks. The point is like capitalism is awful. So access to alienation in the work sphere is not liberation. That's one perspective. I like it. So you can think of like double shifting. Now women work more, they're stressed more, but they still mostly do most of the labor at home. Later, I think we need to talk about how potentially unproductive it is to assign a capitalist industrial labor value and valence to caring for one another. That's also complicated because that's a claim that seems noble. It's like, well, child labor is labor, it ought to be paid. Yes, but is it labor in the same sense of exploitation? Is it labor in the same sense of something that you're entitled to grievance and freedom from? How do we semantically frame? What kind of language do we use to describe and structure those kinds of interactions? So here I'm just opening up the debate on multiple levels. But yeah, and this is something that Jean Twenge documented as well. in her book, which is that children are spending less time unsupervised. And some people say, well, does screen time count as supervision? It's like the parent is there in the house, but the parent is on her screen and the child is on her screen. Yeah, it's true. So because supervision typically means joint attention, which is good, which a child needs in order to develop. Of course, we need to talk about the content of this attention, the intent behind this attention, the valence we assign to this joint attention. However, yes, this is, so here, yes, go on.
So I was just going to ask the graphs. Is there a reason why like Denmark starts so low, or is it just because it's like taken out of scale up?
I don't know. It's from The Economist. We'd have to look. I don't know. The Scandinavians have been ahead of all these trends. In fact, they're so ahead, they're more anti-fragile now again. I think they're addressing, I mean, look at the Swedish model. So again, this is where we would need a longer time to have this conversation respectfully, but I do want to impress upon you, again, this idea that the lower the threat, the higher the anxiety. So yes, of course, sexual assault happens on campus. It happens everywhere. And in other units, I want us to talk about why it may actually be on the rise, because people have no idea how to be gendered anymore. However, this is not Darfur. This is not a sort of a gang assault, on a bus, as it happens in some places. However, there's a lot of bottom-up movements from students here who want to remind each other that the world is unsafe and that they need some kind of intervention. And this is also, it's very beautiful. It's students trying to become parents themselves, who are organizing one another. Remember, this is what I talked about, this zone of proximal development, to say, okay, well, we'll take care of the new ones that are coming in. This is beautiful. This is what you want humans to do. A lot of the themes around which students organize, mobilize one another is about fragility. It's about recognizing, protecting, perhaps on a Homo Fragilis account, keeping, perpetuating into being a kind of fragility. So this is, some of you might have seen this one, it's from Thompson House, the postgraduate club. So these are people who are in their late 20s, 30s, and early 40s, but there's a lot of those. Where was, because there was another one that said, tips for a safe night out, drink plenty of water, don't walk alone, do you have your keys, keep your phones charged. So it's sort of like, your tiger mom calling you, reminding you, do you have your keys? Did you drink plenty of water? Are you okay? Are you home yet? So bottom up reorganization of the same kinds of structures. So stop theft. This, I believe, is a hypnotic suggestion that primes people to be suspicious of one another. You could have a poster that says, look out for each other's stuff, or hey, don't worry, you can ask the person next to you, or hey, we help each other out or something. It's I have this dream of like an longitudinal experiment of like setting up a campus with only positive suggestions, as opposed to 10 seconds to steal your laptop. It's traumatic, trauma. And I invite you to walk around campus or to pick up, like say like the McGill Tribune. So yeah, so unmarked graves, anti-Black racism, and no place. Like it's everywhere, right? It's just trauma, oppression. And no wonder, yes.
I think it's really interesting with the picture of like the important memories and stuff too, that even when you coming in first year with like Frosh and orientation week, obviously that's what it's designed for in mind, is to help people, and see what the resources are. But like for the orientation leaders, you're essentially like, it's like you're taking care of your children, and people just, jokingly say like, oh, my children, I need to make sure my children are okay. Like, because even the leaders are like acknowledging that, yeah, we're, taking care of these people, we're bringing them out to drinking events or whatever and helping them get used to the city.
Yeah, well, your generation, if many of you are third and fourth year, paid a hefty price for this, you're probably a little better off than the one that came just before. I'm not sure. I think the next generation of student is going to be okay, because at this point, it's too much and everyone sees it. So I know my own son is a first-year student at McGill, and he just started Frosh, and I hear what him and his friends were saying, and it's like, it's too much ramming this down our throat. Of course, we need to talk about assault, we need to talk about oppression, but not like this. So likely, the next generation of youth will rebel by being a little more anti-fragile, whereas a lot of these things are in place because it was students like you who wanted these structures to be in place because there was a need, because there was an actual lack of these structures. So there's a first generation of students starting not too long ago, probably those who entered, in mid-2000, 2010 even. And those were okay because they were mobilizing to create something that was absolutely needed. And then there was a bit of, most people still didn't know about it. It was a bit more chaotic, but now it has become so obviously simplified and imposed from above that the average student is likely to develop some critical thinking about this. Hopefully we won't have too many outright opposition or completely reject this, because this is something that might happen. Okay, it's too bad, I see, because I have lots of other really cool pictures that I wanted to analyze together. So we'll do that later. We'll do that next class. But I just want to conclude one thing. No, these ones are amazing. We'll need to talk about this at some point.